It's Baxie's musical podcast.
Resistance is useless!
One of the things that seems undeniably true is that music isn't just a series of notes that are strung together. It's more than just a bunch of rhythmic patterns being played on musical instruments with a bunch of lyrics meant to break things up in between guitar solos. Sometimes music is about history, it's about geography, it's about shifts in culture, it's about a lot of stuff. But more importantly, it's about individuals, many of whom would go on to be successful, but many more of them would not. But their relevance and importance over music, and those that would continue to make it, as well as the music scenes that they helped create, cast this enormously looming shadow that still resonates in those cities today. You know, we've all heard about the music scenes in both New York and London back in the 1970s. You've probably heard about the scenes developing in Los Angeles, Minneapolis, Athens, Georgia, Memphis, Washington, D.C., and Seattle. But those were hardly the only ones. There was also Cleveland, Ohio. In fact, so much of rock history is neatly tied to the city of Cleveland and throughout northern Ohio, but it's almost a shame that Cleveland gets such a bad rap. Often referred to for years as the mistake on the lake, this was an area of the country in which the late Alan Freed first coined the term rock and roll in the 1950s. This is a region that spawned bands like the James Gang, the Raspberries, the Electric Eels. It would then spread to cities like Akron, Ohio, which was the home of Chrissie Hynde from the Pretenders, or Lux Interior from the Cramps, and Devo as well. Cleveland was also the home of a band called Rocket from the Tombs. This was an incredibly influential local band that would eventually splinter off into different groups after only being together for about a year. Specifically, guitarist Cheetah Chrome and drummer Johnny Blitz would team up with the late Stiv Bators to form one of the most quintessential New York punk bands ever, the Dead Boys. Meanwhile, Rocket from the Tombs singer David Thomas and guitarist Peter Lofner would form the legendary avant-garde masters Pere Ubu. Meanwhile, bass player Craig Bell would leave Ohio and settle in Connecticut, where he himself enjoyed a long musical career as well. And while Rocket from the Tombs never completed a debut album before breaking up in 1975, a number of their songs would become punk rock anthems for both Pere Ubu and the Dead Boys. Songs like Sonic Reducer, Ain't It Fun, Final Solution, Life Stinks, and 30 Seconds to Tokyo, and several others. And while that story is a pretty important one, the legacy of Peter Lofner, both before and after 1975, is one that up until recently has never been properly told as it deserves to be. Sadly, Peter Lofner died in 1977 at the age of 24, and while many people might know the story behind his life, his influence on the entire music and cultural scene in Cleveland and throughout northern Ohio can never be overstated. Lofner was a poet, a music journalist, a songwriter, and a guitar player that served as an underlying presence throughout some of the most volatile times in one of the country's most misunderstood cities. A new book has been released by author and illustrator Aaron Lange from Stone Church Press entitled Ain't That Fun? Peter Lofner and Protopunk in the Secret City. It's an incredible story that not only looks at the city's amazing history, it looks at the culture, the crimes, the tragedies, and neglect that Cleveland has endured for generations. Lange also looks at the life and times of Peter Lofner and the significant role he played during his brief and influential life. It's a story about a very damaged soul whose tendency toward self-destruction is both incredibly sad, but is a reflection of the city from where he came from. In previous episodes, I've spoken to both Cheetah Chrome and to Craig Bell from Rocket from the Tombs, and in those interviews, we spoke about who Peter Lofner was, but we never dove into the details of what makes him such a crucial and iconic figure in American music. Because the truth is, he really was. This is my conversation with author and illustrator Aaron Lange on Baxie's musical podcast. Thank you very much for sending the book over. I am literally just about done reading it. I've probably got like 30, 35 pages left to go. It's really, really, well done. I mean, first of all, Peter Lofner is like one of those characters that kind of fits into a much larger story, but he's always a name that, I've always associated with Pere Ubu and others. Tell me about what was it about Peter Lofner that made you decide, I want to construct this story the best way I can.
Well, I'm from Cleveland, and I remember, as like a teenager, living in suburban Cleveland, I had these very like outdated fantasies of like exciting New York. In my mind, it was still like Andy Warhol's Factory and CBGB's. I didn't know who Giuliani was and what gentrification was. So, I wanted to escape where I lived. This is the late 1990s and go to New York or go to London, you know, and just Cleveland just seemed like this dull place to get out of. And then Rhino Records put out a collection of post-punk music, an anthology on CD, which I bought like at the local strip mall. And I was listening to that in my teenage bedroom, and this one song jumped out at me, Final Solution.
Mm.
I was like, this is really something. And I'm looking at the little booklet, the little liner notes, and it says, these guys are from Cleveland. And I was like, really? Like something really cool came out of here? And that just, I don't know, that just really had a strong impact on me. And it would be years before I learned Peter Lochner's name, but I liked Per Ubu. And then when the old Rocket from the Tomb stuff got released and they got back together with the surviving members, Peter's name started coming up like at parties and just like you kind of like in always sort of these hushed tones, like, can you believe this guy? And I just kind of developed an interest in that whole early Cleveland scene. Just always kind of on the back burner of my mind in like my 20s and when I was younger. And then I just started looking into it more and more. And I was like, there's a story here. And it's been written about, but I felt like it hadn't been fully told.
My discovery about him is kind of like yours. I had bought the Pierre Ubu first album, Modern Dance, and I'm seeing all these, these attributions to Loeffner, and then I start doing the podcast, and I'm talking to Cheetah Chrome, and I'm talking to, Craig Bell, and they're all talking about Peter Loeffner, but there's never really been a substantial treatment of his life story, and it's a really interesting one. And I think what you did in this book is really important because I think to get any kind of context for his story, you really have to look at, the history and the psychology of the city of Cleveland and also throughout northern Ohio. So many things affected, culture in that town. It didn't just happen on its own. It really developed from a number of factors. And you cover that in the book, I think, very, very well.
Yeah, to understand Peter Lochner and to understand the early Cleveland punk scene, you have to understand deindustrialization. You have to understand the distance yet proximity to New York. You have to understand what was going on in Detroit. You have to understand Kent State and the rubber factories, what was going on over in Akron. I mean, without industrialization, you don't have Per Ubu, and without Kent State, you don't have Devo.
Yeah.
These things cannot be separated. So you kind of have to, let's start at the beginning. Let's talk about John D. Rockefeller and the Gilded Age and how this city became, one of the major American cities and then collapsed. And there were just these vacant warehouses for the bands to repurpose and use. And you have to understand all of that.
It's funny. I spent about a dozen years living in up in Milwaukee, and I would make the trip from Massachusetts to Wisconsin, pretty frequently. And every time I drove through Cleveland, it's always been somewhat of an afterthought as a city and sometimes maybe even the butt of jokes. But the truth of the matter is, when I've been through Cleveland, I think, well, this isn't so bad. And it had been such a hub of, substantial wealth and culture and architecture. And many times over, it all kind of went to shit. And that's part of the story. I mean, it's a character in this book that's like an undeniable overseer of everything that happened.
Yeah. And I make no mistake, I don't glorify the industrialists. I mean, their wealth was built on like fighting organized labor, and their wealth was built on exploitation. But we cannot deny the fact that they were also philanthropists.
Yeah.
And truly were. And because of that, we have cultural institutions here. We have a world-class art museum and things like that. So they did leave a legacy that cannot be dismissed in spite of, what they did to the unions and everything. So it's very complicated. So I don't put these people on a pedestal. I will acknowledge their contributions. And that's what's interesting about Cleveland, that it is this kind of collapsed, fallen place, but we still have this grand architecture and these kind of ghosts of our past. And it's kind of creepy. I mean, I was just walking around downtown yesterday, and it's just like this ghost town. But there's these like ionic columns and this statuary, and like you'll never see a cop. There's just no police, and like the homeless people act like you're in their living room, and you are. It's their turf. It's like you got to pay the toll.
Well, I want to get into the Lofner story in more detail in a minute, but the thing that I was stunned by as I'm going through the book is, especially as I'm going through all the illustrations, this must have taken you forever to put together. 428 pages, different illustration on every page, and in a storyline that's incredibly detailed. Like I said, you're going back into time to really look at Cleveland, and then you get into the story of Lofner. Tell me a little bit about what it took to put all of this into the form of a book.
Yeah, it took years. I mean, the first year I wasn't even really working on it in any sense that people would imagine. I was more just kind of like, I just decided I was going to do this, and I thought about it every day. But for about a year, I was just sort of immersing myself into the subject matter and just like accruing research material, just like records, books, fanzines, starting to talk to people, like talking to John Morden from the Electric Eels, and just kind of just getting my thoughts together and my sources together.
Yeah.
And I was living in Philadelphia at the time. But then my wife got a job in Cleveland. And so we moved back, and I was gone for a long time. So it was kind of like good timing. And as soon as I landed back in Cleveland, I got to work. But then even like about the first year and a half of work I did, I ended up taking those pages and basically threw them in the trash, and I started over.
Really?
I was being sloppy. I didn't like have a full outline. I was figuring things out. So there were some false starts, and then I got going, and then I'd go back and edit. And editing an illustrated comic book like this is a lot different than editing a traditional, book that you just write, where you can just go into your Word document and add things and delete things. All that artwork's done by hand. So if I want to change something, I have to get an X-Acto knife and cut it out and paste in a new part. So yeah, it's very, very time consuming.
This is true of every music scene there's ever been in America. You always have this regional culture with a lot of cities, whether it's, New York or, Chicago or LA or London for that matter. And it's very easy to think about music scenes in terms of, well, who was successful out of that scene. But the fact of the matter is, it's more often about the people that were outside of that sphere of success. Lofner is kind of one of those guys. There's very, very few recorded products that he recorded, but his presence in this story and throughout Cleveland during the 70s it's undeniable. But to me, I mean, how would you describe his particular role in that Cleveland, and for at least that decade and a half that he was active?
It's a difficult question, because Peter was a real chameleon, and you get this sense in talking to different people who knew him. He showed different sides of himself to different people. And some people you'd think, okay, he was phony or a poser. I don't think that's true. He was just very complicated. So Peter was also, we have this image of him as this like punk rock figure, this punk rock architect, and he was. But he also was a folkie. He played on the folk circuit. He wrote a lot of poetry. And he was also a music critic. He wrote for Cream, and he wrote for the local papers. So Peter was on speed. He did amphetamine, and he just had a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of energy. So he was kind of a cheerleader for the scene, and he kind of just like encouraged everybody, and he wrote about the other bands, and him and his wife Charlotte helped get gigs together, and they knew media people. Like they knew people at the major radio station. The Electric Eels did not. Those guys were antisocial fuck-ups. So Peter and his wife they were savvy, for Clevelanders at least, and they got things going.
When I've talked to guys like Cheetah Chrome and Craig Bell, they all kind of say the same thing. This is a very intense, very dark, but incredibly talented guy who was equally self-destructive too. In the book, you talk, a lot of instances about where he's focused on one thing, but then the alcohol or the drugs or whatever it may be, get in the way of him kind of continuing down a lane for very long. It sounded like that he had just a very restless demeanor about him, always into something different and in multiple different directions.
I think it was his wife, his ex-wife. They did divorce. I believe she said it just wasn't happening fast enough for Peter. And some of that might have been the amphetamines and just, his incredible enthusiasm. But yeah, I mean, it's amazing how much he did get done in his short life. And it's also just amazing how like brief every project was. I mean, had Peter Lochner lived just a year or two longer, and had he stayed in Pere Ubu even just 6 months longer, it would be a very different story. But like he just like flamed out so goddamn fast. It's kind of like we have this sort of cultural myth about the rock star who dies young. But Peter wasn't a rock star. He wasn't famous. And he died super young. You're supposed to get famous and then die. And like Peter did, he died like as Lester Bangs said, he was the first new wave casualty, new wave punk, whatever. So it is kind of an unprecedented thing where it was just like so accelerated.
I think you're right. I think he lived, a couple more years. His legacy probably would have been a whole lot more well known. I mean, not just within Ohio, but beyond it. But those that knew him, when they were no longer with him, they felt like they kind of shredded something kind of important, and they were kind of happy to not watch him just completely dissolve over time. You talk about his final months and the health issues that he was having and the inability to really do anything. It was a very, very sad end. It sounded like this was not a complete surprise to anybody that spent a lot of time with him, that this was the direction that he was ultimately heading in.
No, I don't think they were surprised. And I think it's important to stress that, like, and this kind of goes back to what we were saying a moment ago, Peter didn't overdose or commit suicide. He drank himself to death.
Yeah.
Like the way an old man would. Like when Jack Kerouac drinks himself to death. How old was Kerouac? In his 40s when he died?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's young, but I mean, you could drink yourself to death by your 40s. To drink yourself to death in your 20s, I mean, like you almost have to like be impressed. Like that's not an easy thing to do.
No, it's not. That actually takes a lot of patience and time and dedication.
Right, and I used to have a drinking problem. So like I never got hospitalized, and I drank a lot. I had a problem. And if I was, and he was going to the hospital a lot. I probably should have got more into his hospital visits in the book, but I think there's just so many, and like there's not much information.
Right.
It's just like, yeah, he went to the hospital again. I mean, what are you supposed to say?
I've always been fascinated by the whole, Rocket from the Tombs thing. This is a band that he was in along with, Cheetah Chrome and, Blitz and David Thomas. And, once the band fractured and, again, almost nearly no significant recordings when they were together, but, out of this band came these, iconic anthems, punk anthems, everything from, Sonic Reducer to Final Solution and, 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. I mean, these are massive songs. And you have to wonder, well, what would have happened had Rocket from the Tombs been able to stay together? Because I mean, to me, it's just like, well, how did this even happen? That a band like this would exist, and all of these great anthems would be born out of it.
Right, and so they split into, Dead Boys and Pere Ubu, and you cannot think of two groups that could be more different.
Right.
There, so that these and then you also what Craig did, because then Craig had his band, the Saucers, as well, who should not be discounted. But yeah, Dead Boys and Pere Ubu are just like complete opposites. So that these guys were in a band together it was almost like they were a super group but did it backwards.
One way, Pere Ubu is kind of like an art band, whereas the Dead Boys were like a band that just wanted to break shit.
The Dead Boys were basically like a Detroit style glam rock band.
Absolutely.
They had the long hair when they were Frankenstein and all that. And they got to New York and saw what was going on and cut their hair. But they were doing like Detroit glam rock, like Alice Cooper, the Stooges, that kind of thing. And the Dead Boys, I think, were a great rock and roll band. Absolutely great, especially that first album. As someone writing, they're a little less interesting to me just because, like, okay, they rock, they're great. I don't have much to say about that. While Pere Ubu being artier and my tastes kind of leaning in more a pretentious way in general, there's a lot more to examine with Pere Ubu when their lyrics and just the kind of things that David Thomas writes in his other writings or things he says in interviews. You know, he's kind of from like a European avant-garde tradition. And Peter was to a point too. And there's a lot to really dig into there.
I think so too, and I think Thomas is one of those guys who you just always remain somewhat enigmatic. It's like you don't really know what's going on with him because the songs can be so obscure and not always pretty to listen to. But those first couple of albums by Pere Ubu are amazing. Actually, there's a bunch of albums from that band that are amazing.
Their discography is a mess because what happens is the last two albums from their sort of like classic period are really, really impenetrable. It's like very Dada. There's a lot of just like kind of like almost like nursery rhyme, like children noises and like bird noises. And I think a lot of people just like they give up, and I don't blame them because I don't really like those two albums either. But then they came back and they had kind of like a pop period that was sort of interesting. And then they kind of like returned to their roots and they did some really good stuff. And it's just they're still together. Like, Thomas is the only original member, but they have so many albums and it really just ebbs and flows. And if you stick it out, it's almost like a band like Can or The Fall, where there's just this huge imposing body of work. And, I've been a fan for over 20 years and I'm still discovering new stuff. And then there's the live albums because Pere Ubu is a great live band.
Yeah.
Like the live recordings are often better.
I see the connection to The Fall. That's actually a really good connection because on one hand, when Marky Smith was writing great songs, it's like you can't. There's no band better. But on the other hand, there's a lot of stuff that really is hard for the average listener to listen to, but it's a really satisfying body of work if you're willing to take the time and have the patience to go through it.
Yeah, and then I think there's some analogs between David Thomas and Marky Smith where you have this band that really is just this front man. It's this project, and then the lineup just changes. We have to say, it should be said though that Pere Ubu's lineup later on was actually quite stable for a while. Some of the later members were members way longer than any of the original members were. Like his bass player, Michelle, she might still be with him. I mean, she's been with him since the 90s, so some people stick it out with him.
There's a point in the book where Peter Loeffner goes to New York and tries to aggressively get, involved in the New York scene. I recently interviewed, Richard Lloyd at television, and there's a whole part in his book and a little bit in your book where Loeffner tries to replace him in the band. He had left television for a period of time. Loeffner tries to get in there. It didn't work, and they wind up getting Richard Lloyd again. But there's also some other stories of him barely functioning in New York, trying to get on stage to play with Patti Smith at CBGB's. I mean, at that point when he is trying to, at least, I don't know if he's trying to legitimize himself in front of in New York or what he's trying to do, but he just wasn't together enough to make any of that happen. And it sounds like New York was probably a pretty big, embarrassing, traumatic experience for him.
I think he was, from what I've heard, he was pretty humiliated about that incident at the Patti Smith concert, but he made friends in New York. He brought television and the Heartbreakers to Cleveland for their first shows outside of New York. So, they obviously were like listening to him. They're like, oh, okay, you say something's going on over here. You'll put together a show. They followed him out, and he hung out with those people. He knew them, I'm sure, and they all had their drug problems too.
Yeah,
and Lester Banks certainly took him seriously. They were best friends.
But Lester also kind of knew where he was coming from and said, this guy He is a legitimate guy. He kind of had that stamp of approval.
And yeah, it's a shame. Peter did go to New York a lot, but he only performed there once with Per Ubu.
Yeah.
But I don't think Ubu would have gone without Peter. I think David Thomas had kind of like a fuck New York kind of attitude, which is common in Cleveland.
It's common through all the Midwest cities. Fuck New York should be like on billboards and T-shirts.
Yeah.
One of the things that you did in the book that I thought was really kind of cool was the use of the lyrics from the song, Life Stinks. Whether it's Life Stinks, I Need a Drink. It runs throughout the entire book, and it sums up a couple of things. I mean, one, the mess of of Peter's life on one hand, but it also illustrates kind of that inferiority complex that runs through the city of Cleveland. And I thought the relevance of including that in a lot of the illustrations was actually really an appropriate, inclusion. I mean, tell me about the decision to do that. I mean, did you think about that, early on in this process, or was it kind of something that said, then maybe I can add like one more thing here?
It just, so the book's early stages, like the book began with like a much more kind of nihilistic perspective. It was a little bit more like celebrating like the death tripping, and those inelegant Life Stinks lyrics kind of like just fit that really well. But like, I worked on this book a long time, and I got older, and I realized like this is like, I'm working on this for a very, very long time. Do I want to spend years and have my message be fuck you? And I was like, maybe, maybe I should add a little more to this. And I believe I did, but the whole Life Stinks refrain stayed. And I'm glad it did, because it's as blunt and dumb as it is, it gets at something succinct. And there's some irony there.
Oh, absolutely. But it's an appropriate inclusion. It ties, it really does tie everything together. His own lyrics, the whole storyline, the history. You mentioned Devo, and you mentioned Akron, and the influence that they had with things like Kent State. You're absolutely right. There would be no Devo without Kent State. But that, like so many other things in the book, appear to be really important points in Ohio's history, and how psychologically people react to their own backyard and their own self point of view. It had this enormous effect, to the point where I think anybody that had been on Kent State or was living there at the time have always been deeply affected by what happened there.
Sure. Growing up, you'd hear like, oh, yeah, like when our history teacher, he was at Kent State, or like so and so's mom was there, or like, I mean, like it was real, so you'd hear about it growing up, and it was just sort of like, kind of like, God, what the fuck happened over there? It was just awful.
I think over the last couple of years, people are finally understanding. I mean, not only is Chrissy Hine from Akron, and she was, also a student at the time. From everything from like that Sex Pistols miniseries that came out like last year or the year before, I think people are finally starting to realize the connectivity that Chrissy has through not just American music, but what she was involved in when she went to London. If there was ever anybody whose life story would be unbelievable to be told, it would be hers. I mean, her life story is just absolutely fascinating to me.
I read her book, Reckless. It's good. Yeah, and I think when I started out, I planned on having more of her and the Pretenders in the story, but just didn't happen. I don't know why.
Because you're 428 pages into it already.
Right? Yeah, I could have just gone forever, and I didn't want to make it specifically just about rock bands.
Yeah,
I wanted to talk about like the beatnik poetry scene in Cleveland, and I wanted to talk about the industrial stuff, and then it's like, then I'm talking about Elliot Ness. I'm not entirely even sure why, but it just felt like the right thing to do.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it all fits into a larger picture. One of the things that you did talk about, and I'm glad you did, because it's a really important component in understanding music over the last 50 years. Fanzines and rock journalism. You mentioned Lester Bangs and Cream Magazine, but you even talk about R. Crumb in the book too. The importance of these these do-it-yourself, magazines, as far as getting people to understand the music that was coming out in 1976, 1977. I mean, these really were essential, publications for people in learning about what was going on, beyond their own backyard.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it was like the internet. And this is interesting. And I kind of wanted to get into it in the book, but I just ran out of space, especially in part 3. But the old zine Search and Destroy,
Yeah.
yeah, from San Francisco. There's a lot of Cleveland stuff in there. So I was always kind of like, what's this all about? Well, as it turns out, so the punk record store here in Cleveland was called Drome. I talk about them a little in the book. And they carried Search and Destroy. And then the Cleveland fanzine, which was called Cleve, there's all sorts of features and ads for these various San Francisco bands. And like, what's going on here? So it turns out that basically the stuff that was in Search and Destroy about Cleveland was actually like written by people in Cleveland, and they were just like, they were almost like foreign correspondents. So between these two fanzines, they were kind of telling each other like, well, what's going on. So you could get San Francisco records in Cleveland, and you can get Cleveland stuff in San Francisco. And it was just this kind of like slow motion exchange of ideas and information. And I think that's really neat. And because you can see the trail they left behind in these magazines.
I mean, I've been doing radio for 30 some odd years, and it's always funny to me when someone says, yeah, there's no good music coming out anymore. You can't find it. No one hears. There's all these bands I've never heard of, and I keep reminding them that finding out about new music has always required a bit of effort, regardless of where it was, whether it was talking to the guy at the record store about what you like and what's coming out or what's out right now, or fanzines, or even if it's Rolling Stone for that matter. It always requires some level of effort to find out what's really going on. And I think, like you said, it's kind of like the internet. I mean, it really was kind of like a social media before that ever happened, and it really informed a lot of people's palette of taste in music. I mean, that they served such an important role, not so much because people were reading them, but it influenced your next door neighbor, and then you learned about what he was listening to, and it's like a big giant Amway pyramid of information. Right. And then education.
Yeah, it's right. People complaining about there not being good music. People do the same thing with books. Oh, there's no good books anymore. Yeah, there are. They're from smaller publishers. You're not going to find them in Borders.
Yeah.
You might not even find them in any stores. But there's been a real renaissance of like small presses putting out, because they're just the big publishers do suck. They are putting out the same old crap. But people are responding to that, and there's like definitely a DIY thing going on, even though people don't necessarily talk about it in those terms. And the media, but they don't get reviewed. The distributors don't pick it up, so the stores don't pick it up. But it doesn't mean it's not happening. You just have to kind of look for it.
Well, I want to ask you a little bit about that, because I mean, you're the co-founder of Stone Church Press, which is it's a relatively new company. I think you started it like last year, maybe the year before. I mean, it's a pretty new company. But what you've put out, I mean, visually beautiful books, and yours is no exception. I mean, I love the illustrations that were put into this, and I think self-publishing this, it's a big ask to put out something that's taking you this long to do. But everybody else is doing DIY businesses now, and why wouldn't you do it?
Yeah, so I started Stone Church Press with my friend Jake Kelly, who's also an artist and a writer. And I thought it would be a small operation in which we could just kind of sell our own like mini comics or just like things we wanted to do. And because I had an agent and I wanted to get Ain't It Fun put out by a big publisher.
Sure.
I wanted it in distribution and just done right. And my agent couldn't sell it. Nobody wanted it. And I could have, now mind you, I probably could have found a smaller publisher that would have taken it. But at that point, I'm a smaller publisher. Why should I give it to someone else of the same size?
Right.
And I'm glad we started Stone Church when we did, because it's hard, and just like there's a real learning curve. So we had the website set up. We knew it worked. We had a business bank account. We had a shipping system set up. We got hooked up with a distributor. So we were kind of ready to go. But this was definitely been our biggest project to date. But it's still started from square one with a book this size. And I don't just mean the size of the book, but I mean the size of the print run and the publicity and everything. We would have been just in over our head. But we had a nice trial run of a year of selling smaller books to get ready.
Well, I mean, like I said, it's an amazing story, not only just of Peter Lofner, but really kind of understanding about Ohio and about Cleveland and about the role of the place. I mean, you're talking about everything from Alan Freed to the Raspberries to Devo to Pierre Ubu. All of this is going on. It's a really substantially rich region that so much great music has come out from, and to understand any of it, this is like one of the first books I've read that even addresses what really went into Cleveland and his reputation for rock and roll.
Right. Yeah. Because it's not just me being like navel gazing, like, oh, I live in Cleveland, let me write about Cleveland. But like Alan Freed, the term rock and roll was coined here. So there's are very legitimate reasons to explore this in depth. Like, it's not just like a regional interest book. This is a book that anyone could find interesting. Like people who don't live in New York like to read about CBGBs and the Velvet Underground and what was going on there. And I think some of the publishers, though, they're in New York and they're like, oh, Cleveland, pass. They're elitists.
Well, I'm sure you remember this, when the Hall of Fame was being planned in Cleveland, and there were all these people saying, Cleveland, why, of all places, why is it in Cleveland? And the history of rock and roll is, Cleveland plays a huge part in that. And those that did any historical research or understood the story behind it said, okay, it does make sense, but I'm pretty sure most of America doesn't realize how deep it goes in Cleveland.
So you're half right. There is like a legitimate cultural claim to why we have the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and Alan Freed just being part of that. But what it really comes down to in reality is Cleveland wanted it.
Yeah.
And they fought to have it. New York didn't care. New York, the people in charge of zoning commissions and whatever in New York, they don't need another museum. They don't need to boost tourism. They had no skin in the game. But the people in political influence and power in Cleveland saw an opportunity, and so they fought and campaigned to get the Rock Hall. Smartly, I suppose.
Yeah.
People visit, they talk about it. People say, I went to the Rock Hall. My dad loved it. It's always like their dad. It's a nice museum. It really is. And they have a fantastic archive, which I made use of in my research. A fantastic archive. As far as the Hall of Fame itself and who gets inducted, I don't give a shit. Yeah. And when people like complain, they're like, why is so and so in, and why is it so and so? I'm like, why are you paying it? It's like the Academy Awards. I don't care. I don't need some like cool independent film I like to get Best Picture.
Right.
Just like I don't need The Fall to be recognized by the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It's absurd to me.
I know, but I think people get so passionate about the bands that they love, and they would like that there's a part of them that would like to see somebody else acknowledge and validate that feeling over a particular band. But I agree with you. Ultimately, it's not that important whether Joy Division gets in someday or doesn't get in. But it's just funny how so many people take it so seriously and so passionately.
Yeah, it just seems like boomer Beatle fans. But then the punk people do it. You see that, like, why is Devo even in now? I don't even remember. I remember like people really bent about Devo not getting in.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't believe they are. But
yeah, I don't know. I know they got nominated.
Yeah, I just don't know if they won. I mean, I think what really pisses people off is just this like the political parts of excluding some people that probably should be in, and then turning a blind eye to people that probably have no business being in there. I think that drives people a little batshit.
Well, it's funny. You look at like the early history of it, and they're like always putting in these like obscure like doo-wop and like early rock and roll groups that no one knows now, because it's like, well, these people were really important when they were doing this,
right?
And they are Hall of Famers. But then, like, that doesn't put that doesn't make any money or generate enthusiasm. And so and it's a lot of the times these are like black groups.
Yeah.
So there's some very deserving early groups that have been ignored just because it's not Fleetwood Mac, and there's no how do you trump it up into something that makes money?
I've been in the Hall of Fame twice. The first time we got caught in a blizzard in Buffalo, and we got to Cleveland with like 35 minutes before the Hall of Fame closed. And so, so you start at the top of the building and you work your way down. The first time I saw it, I saw the entire museum in exactly 22 minutes. It's like a sprint down down the stairs to make sure. I said, okay, I saw it. I was here. It's time to get back in the car and go.
It's not that big.
No, it's not. But when you do have the opportunity to stay, for a good period of time, there's a lot of really great stuff inside of it.
There is some interesting stuff in there for sure. I kind of hate the building, even though I like the architect, I.M. Pei. But I think that building's a real eyesore. I digress.
Well, Aaron, this has been really cool. Like I said, I've enjoyed the book a lot. Ain't it fun? And I wish you best of luck with it and other projects, because I think what you're doing is really very cool.
Thank you,
Aaron. Thank you very much for the time today. Appreciate it.
Yeah, it was my pleasure.
The name of Aaron Lange's new book is called Ain't It Fun? Peter Lawfer and Proto-Punk in the Secret City, published by Stone Church Press, and it is awesome. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, feel free to like it, share it, rate it, tell all your friends about it, and be sure to check out the latest updates on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. You can also email me at bax@rock102.com. I'd love to hear what you think. And thanks again for listening to Baxie's Musical Podcast.